Hello, my name is Daniel Backer and welcome to Off the Wall Novels. Today I am going to be sharing chapter 1 of the novel that I just released called Lionel Lancet and the Right Vibe. Art Lancet died climbing out of a window in his cliffside home in Palos Verdes, California. He lay on his side with his pants down, facing the ocean, jaw open, wind freeing white hairs from his comb-over and blowing them into a clump like a cockatiel's plume. The tribal print kurta he wore had a scuff of dirt across the back, which would have mortified him if he were not already dead. He got it half price at a meditation retreat in Maui. The legacy Art left amounted to the organization he created, the Fiduciary Royalties Association for United Donors. To anyone at the IRS, it was a charitable foundation with many ventures under its umbrella, one of which funded the development of pharmaceutical drugs in collaboration with the National Institutes of Health. But the foundation also functioned as an entity Art could defer to when anyone questioned his reputation. Rumors circulated that he had a veritable medicine cabinet full of other ventures that were off the books. Art's passing marked the end of an era for the Fiduciary Royalties Association for United Donors. He steered the foundation since the Reagan years through every tax loophole and market fluctuation, and the United Donors, always rearing for their fiduciary royalties, were handsomely rewarded for their investments. Constant thriving imbued the group with a mystical air, invoked through contracts and rituals behind closed doors, but with its high priest dead, the numinous had been snuffed out, and the whole foundation declined into stiff, corporate scrambling. But the role that earned Art his money was far from the real him, a distant reverberation of the baby boom that allowed him to get caught up in the counterculture of the 60s before relenting to a more corporate vibe. He meditated Om before all stock trades, and occasionally dropped LSD. Almost anyone who met him heard about his encounter with the divine on 4 tabs before Francis was born, and during his midlife crisis, he started a manuscript for a self-help book called Fee Here Now, an attempt to combine Eastern spiritual wisdom with the guidelines of financial consulting, but he abandoned it after his wife left. Art regularly added evidence to the case that he was a crier, mostly catalyzed by music. My Sweet Lord by George Harrison would come on, and he would put a hand on the shoulder of whoever stood closest to him, as though he needed help standing, his head bowed down. Tears would well up in his eyes but never quite spill out. After the last jubilant Hare Krishna faded out, Art would compose himself, shaking his head, and return to earth as though he had no say in getting carried away, only to find himself disappointed that his hostage had lost interest. The machinations of increasing profits and dodging taxes seemed like a dry and lifeless pursuit, but Art felt it like music. The profits, unencumbered by regulations and taxes, soared like a hopeful melody. The effect of music is not its meaning, and the profit is hardly about the number. It's the growth, the smooth upward curve, the sublime anticipation of climax as everything builds to a crescendo. The strictures of rationality and materialism faded away as his dividends racked up indefinitely like an infinite surplus sent from beyond the earthly plane, squeezing between slivers of space between individual dollars. The evening of his death, Art slept at his home office, drooling on the paper spread across his desk. Plaques with shiny nameplates and plastic corporate logos faced the entrance for visitors to see. A knock on his front door startled him awake, and a tax form stuck to his sunburned cheek when he raised his head. It drooped down and landed on the floor with the smallest of sounds. The trellis outside the floor-to-ceiling windows diced the light from the sunset into a spotted pattern on the floor. Some of the spots disappeared, effaced by the silhouette of someone trying to peek inside. A moment later, there was another firm knock on the door. Art held his breath and shivered with an adrenaline tickle he hadn't felt since playing hide-and-seek as a boy. The maid's footsteps sounded outside the office. Art's stage whispered, "Constance, don't answer it." Constance's irises blended in with her pupils, and her mouth opened slightly, giving her an earnest, engaged expression. Hunched in his chair, Art heard her pass through the foyer and open the front door, and he risked a breath, smelling the musk of his cigar that had gone out in the white marble ashtray. "I need to speak with Art Lancet," said the voice at the door. "Is he home?" "Yes, please come in." Art threw his hands up. After a moment of panic, he rolled his plump body out of the chair, and upon impact with the floor, vertigo gripped him and sent the parquetry pattern below squirming in his vision. He shuddered and gasped, struggling to get up. Constance's knuckles rapped gently on the office door, followed by a heavy pounding from the visitor, and Art began his pained crawl toward the only escape, a window on the southern wall. He bumped into the faded yellow surfboard propped against the window frame and barely managed to stop it from crashing down on top of him. It had been too long since he last took it down to Lunata Bay. "Is everything okay?" called Constance through the door. Trembling, Art climbed his hands up the wall and clasped the windowsill. With a moan, he rose to his feet and pressed the heels of his palms beneath the window's horizontal muntin, but it didn't budge. The latch was almost completely open, but not enough. He bared his teeth at it for inhibiting his escape. By the time the visitor pushed past Constance and entered the office, the window was open. Art's top half hung outside, and his large, bare rump was on display in a proud greeting. With a flop, his bottom half went over the ledge, and out he tumbled, landing on his back. The house was a ranch, so he didn't fall very far, but the sudden exertion of his aged body sent spasms down his left arm. As the swelling energy in his chest intensified, he attempted to cry out, but the muscles in his torso contracted as if they were trying to prevent something from escaping his body. The small sound that managed to get out was a choked "kh" from the back of his throat. The visitor was none other than Melanie Bobbers, internet-famous lawyer-vlogger, i.e. vlogger, wearing a sport coat, pinstripe slacks, and a fed-up expression on her face. The icon for her vlog, Little Miss Prosecute, depicted a minimal rendering of her in profile, the left side of her head shaved and her lips pursed in defiance. She enjoyed a substantial following that venerated her for confronting rich and powerful men, capturing her exploits with a hidden camera pinned in her lapel. A small-time television director gave her an acting tip to strike more fear in her targets. Just don't blink. She could go for several minutes now, dry-eyed and unrelenting. Her posture betrayed that she bent over books for years, so when she caught herself craning too far forward, she would shift her shoulders down and her head back, which she tried to do as nonchalantly as possible. Melanie fought traffic from Highland Park to personally deliver a subpoena, rehearsing for an hour and a half what she would say as she served the papers. It was all for naught as Art presently lay convulsing on the ground. In spite of occasional performative stargazing, Art enjoyed most of his waking life upright, allowing for the comforting solidity of the earth to fill everything below the horizon and the enticing ethereal sky to hover above it as a neat symmetrical opposite in his field of view. But now it dawned on him as he lay on his back how much more territory the sky occupied, looking down on him as if he were a ladybug in its palm. The clouds and all that lay beyond them began to swirl into a withdrawn point, and he erupted in blubbering terror at being invited to enter. It had been waiting for him his entire life. A presence was with him now like a calm parent comforting a child who was afraid of something that carried no real threat. Melanie scuffed her heel on the floor, and Constance panicked behind her, peering over her shoulder. Leaning out the window for a better view, Melanie adjusted the camera in her lapel. The sprinkler system turned on and speckled Art's khaki pants that were bunched around his ankles. "We're in a drought, asshole." She retreated to Art's rolling chair and chewed her cheek, indifferent to Constance climbing out of the window. Something in the corner of the room reflected a glint of light where the wainscoting met the wall unevenly behind a small table that held a black stone lingam. As Constance delivered chest compressions, her head bobbing in and out of view through the window, Melanie approached the corner and moved the table out of the way. There was a barely perceptible hinge that swung open, revealing a hidden compartment, and inside was a dagger with a serpent for a handle that was swallowing the bottom of the blade. Melanie positioned the camera to get a cinematic shot with a pleasing lens flare. Art's heartbeat was synchronizing with the waves of the Pacific Ocean, and his hand loosened its grip on the land beneath him. The usual metaphysical gravity that rooted him comfortably in his body let go of him, and he began to slowly evaporate. But in his last lucid moment, he had the wherewithal to command his body one last time, turning his head away from the sky and pointing a trembling, accusatory finger at Constance. She stopped the chest compressions and shrank away from the scorn in his eyes. When he went limp, she wailed. The outline of Catalina Island was the last thing he saw, barely visible in the dark as the sun finally finished setting. The remaining members of the Fiduciary Royalties Association for United Donors were the only attendees at Art's funeral. They congregated on short notice for a small ceremony with mournful hymns and Sanskrit prayers. A censer dangled from the hand of one of the men, effusing incense around the burial plot and a headstone that read, Art Lancet, 1937 through 2016. There was no priest presiding, and no one spoke of the subpoena, but it hung over their bowed heads like a spirit. As Art was lowered into the ground, a leaf blower started a few plots down. A tall man in a navy suit straightened his tie and walked to his black Maserati at a quickened pace. He drove north on Highway 1, and fog rolled up from the ocean, obscuring the divide between the land and the sea, so the tide seemed to reach past its edge, threatening to wash everything away.